Welcome to The Humble Podcaster, the podcast where we help you follow through on your dreams of creating your own show by providing practical knowledge, tips, and tricks on podcast production. Hey there, podcaster. How's it going? I know, it's been, a whole season since we talked last? And I hope you've been doing well since we last talked. I hope you got your podcast launched and that you've been keeping with it. And hey, if you're new to the show, then welcome. I'm happy to have you along for the ride. Starting a podcast can feel like a monumental challenge on its own. And as we've covered last season, there's a lot that goes into just getting the show launched. And once you've launched the show, how then do you grow it? Well, that's what we're going to cover this season. We'll be taking a look at the process I call the podcast listener lifecycle. It's the framework through which I help people understand how their show breaks down and what they can do to grow their audience accordingly. In this episode, I'm going to set the scene for why I've developed this lifecycle and why it's important to podcasters to understand how to better segment their podcast audience. So, let's jump in. In the years I've spent producing podcasts, the question I get asked most often is, how do I grow my podcast? Beyond best practices for marketing and promoting podcasts, I think there's one major thing that most podcasters neglect. Their listeners. Now, this isn't every show, of course, but I often think podcasters can get so focused on production and keeping their show going that they forget about how to engage their audience. What's worse is that most podcasters don't even know who is in their audience, and how could you? The current system makes it darn near impossible to know. Unless your mother comes up and says, "I'm so proud of you in your latest episode where you talked about that thing that I don't understand," you'll have no way of knowing if she truly listened to it. Finding out who is listening will take some legwork, but it's certainly not impossible. First, we need to understand what data is available to us in order to help us make informed decisions about how to grow the show. Then, we need to leverage that information to find our listeners. If you've taken any amount of time to look at your podcast stats, you'll notice there's one statistic that sticks out above all others: downloads. Downloads are the gold standard for podcasting. They determine your success, and they even determine how you get paid if you're running ads on your show. Downloads are the statistic by which most podcast decisions are made. And they are the stat that podcasters tout most often when they're looking for validation in their field. But, and believe me, this is a big but, it's just a number. In our data-driven world, it's easy to jump to the conclusion that, it's a good number and I'm going to brag about it. And I'm not saying you shouldn't. But using downloads as a measurement of the true size of your show is inaccurate at best. At worst, it's way out of proportion to what your podcast audience actually is. You see, a download is essentially just a statistic that a server counts any time it receives a request for the file. Depending on how a podcast player works, it may pull that file every time your podcast plays, or it may not count it at all because the file is being streamed. So why is this stat the standard for the industry if it's so inaccurate? Advertisers have been wondering the same thing for at least a decade now. But the simple answer is that podcasts are audio files hosted from a server and provided to listeners via an RSS feed, which is essentially code that was originally created all the way back in 2003 and hasn't changed much since. In fact, the latest version is 2.0.11, which was released, get this, on March 30th of 2009, almost 13 years ago as of the recording of this podcast. While other code has dramatically improved our ability to track user data and app engagement, the plucky RSS feed remains the heart of podcast distribution. Of course, this means what counts as a download could be anyone or anything without some sort of vetting practice. Thankfully, there is a standard for podcasting. The Interactive Advertising Bureau, or IAB, have a very stringent policy for filtering and vetting files to determine what's real and what's not. So that is really helpful, but it still just leaves us with a number. And thankfully, they are numbers with a clearly defined process, and so they can at least be compared. Hooray! But how helpful really is that? I mean, I'll include a link to the IAB standards so that you can get a better understanding for how they do this and what's actually being managed here. And, for those that really care about that, that'll be really, really useful. But at the end of the day, the important stuff you need to know from those IAB standards is that all of this has two key metrics that they track: downloads and listeners. By IAB standards, a download is defined as a unique file request that was downloaded. This includes complete file downloads as well as partial downloads in accordance with the rules described in the IAB standards. Okay, so that's not super helpful if you want to know who is in your audience. And as for listeners, as defined by IAB, they are as follows: data that represents a single user who downloads content, in parentheses for immediate or delayed consumption, close parentheses. Listeners may be represented by a combination of IP addresses and user agent. The listeners must be specified within a stated time frame: day, week, month, etc. So unique listeners are identified by their IP address and a bunch of other specific information. Cool. That's a much better picture of the audience, right? Yeah, on some level, but here's the problem. A listener, as defined here, is still data. It's not a real person in your audience. As IAB points out in their own documentation, quote, "It is important to understand the limitations of the listener metrics in podcasting due to the nature of the usage. Most users are on mobile devices, which means that the IP addresses change frequently, potentially resulting in double counting users, and also could be recycled, potentially resulting in undercounting users." Close quote. Now, I won't get into the nerdy specifics, but basically the majority of people use devices and internet connections with dynamic IP addresses. Even if you only access your podcast from your house, there's a very low possibility that you'll always have the same IP, unless you've purchased a static IP for your house. And even then, your device could change its IP. So yes, listeners are still a best guess, and marginally better than downloads, sure, but still not as accurate as it could be. And as some podcast experts are quick to point out, it's still just a data point, not a person. So is there any data that can tell us at least how many real people are listening to the show? Well, yes and no. You see, the two largest podcast apps out there, Apple and Spotify, both have a narrower data point based on user data through their app. Apple calls these users engaged listeners, and Spotify calls them listeners, which is a term not to be confused with IAB's definition of listeners. So, how do these terms differentiate and further confuse us themselves? Well, listeners, as formally defined by Spotify, means the number of unique Spotify users who at least start an episode of the podcast. Spotify's definition comes down to a user ID. This is the most reliable way to confirm, yes, one human heard this episode. By contrast, engaged listeners, as defined by Apple, is a unique device that plays more than 20 minutes or 40% of an episode within a single session, when pausing or stopping an episode doesn't count as a new session. That is to say, as long as you're listening to the episode on the same device, it'll count towards you being defined as an engaged listener. So in this instance, Apple is attributing the device with the engagement, not an individual. Therefore, we cannot 100% say, yes, this is a person. Instead, we have to resign ourselves to saying, yes, this is an iPhone or an iPad or a MacBook Pro. Personally, this feels a bit silly. I mean, given that Apple Podcast app already syncs across my devices, you would think that they could also track that information because they clearly have my user ID. And this begs the question, why can't it just attribute engagement per user like Spotify? I'm sure they have a good reason for this, and my guess is probably privacy. But it seems like an easy fix and one that would make their analytics a lot more useful to podcasters. So, unfortunately, that's as good as we're going to get on the analytics front for now. Spotify has the most accurate number in terms of knowing a person listened to an episode, and Apple has what is probably the second most accurate number. And please, do yourself a favor and don't pick at this for too long either. The more you do, the more complicated it becomes. I think this digression also helps to further illustrate why the IAB keeps things to the standards they do. Downloads are the only definitive standard measurement across the board, well, except for sites like Spotify that stream their content. And they help keep these things to a fairly stringent standard, even if all they do is provide evidence of someone tried to play this. None of this information, though, is telling us who is listening. Spotify comes the closest in at least hinting at the fact that they know. But beyond that, we can't just pull up a report and say, here's Chris Hill. He's been listening to your show since the beginning. Oh, and he just re-listened to the whole series. You should reach out to him and see if he'd be interested in joining our Patreon. The good news here is that there is a way to identify the people who listen to your podcast. Extra good news, it's not rocket science, and it doesn't require you to have access to advanced APIs or knowledge of computer programming. It just takes some work. And, of course, this leads us back to the listener lifecycle. The goal of this framework is to help you identify listeners that are drawn to your show and how they are funneled through the different levels of engagement until they ultimately become true fans of your show, which, in turn, help you promote and grow your show at a faster, more effective rate than you could achieve by promoting your show on your own. The focus of this life cycle is on long-term organic growth. These practices are the baseline for having a solid podcast, good marketing, and an engaged audience. It is not a quick hit, quote, get ranked in the top 100 on your first week, unquote, type of campaign. When properly utilized, it will help ensure that once you hit the top 100 of your target category, you stay there. The listener lifecycle is made of 5 key segments: curious, explorer, follower, subscriber, and true fan. We'll cover all these phases and how they relate to one another as we go throughout this series. For now, the important thing you need to know is that this segmentation helps us understand where the data we've discussed in today's episode and more come into play with each phase, and how we can use that to achieve our ultimate goal of growing a dedicated podcast fan base. Now, back to the question of how we find out who is in your podcast audience. Well, using the listener lifecycle, we'll walk through each step to find this out. At the top of the cycle, we've got curious, but we also have true fans. Let's say your friend Brad is a true fan of the show you've been doing. You know this because he shares your content all the time and constantly tells people to listen. You see it on your own social media channels. To be fair, there's a good chance that Brad isn't so much a friend as he is your father, but that's kind of beside the point. Brad shares it with his audience. That's what you need to know. And 10 people in that audience click the link and go to your website. They browse the website, they might click and play an episode or listen to the trailer. These are the people who are curious about your show. We know you've received traffic through Brad's Facebook page because we can see that on Google Analytics, and that's how we know there are X number of people potentially curious about your show. Next, a fraction of those people will listen to an episode, maybe 2, maybe 3, and if your website is set up properly, they'll be linked to their podcast player of choice pretty quickly. And if they really like your show, they'll even click the follow button. Everything after visiting the website, but before clicking that follow button, is what we call the explorer. They're more than curious, they're actively listening, but they're not quite committed yet. They may take a few more reminders or a few more nudges until they finally decide to follow your show and commit to listening on a weekly basis. Once they commit by clicking the follow button on their player of choice, they become a follower of your show. It's in this phase that we're right on the edge of knowing who is in your audience. If you've spent any time with Spotify or Apple's metrics, you'll notice that they include a count for the total followers of your show. This is great to know, and I'm glad they provide these metrics. It's also equally interesting to note that followers do not equal, well, in relation to Spotify, streams or even starts. This is just the total number of people who clicked a button and can see new episodes appear on their podcast tab within the app. In relationship to all podcasts, it's a good reminder that this number is still just a number, and this number doesn't attribute anything to downloads. You've still got to market and promote your show in order to get those followers to listen to your show. One of the best ways to market your show to keep followers engaged is also the simplest conversion to make into the subscriber phase. Email. Once a follower has signed up for your email list, they have become a subscriber. The key difference between a subscriber and a follower is that we can validate the identity of a subscriber. Even if it's just an email address, once they've subscribed, be it a newsletter, online subscription, Patreon, or similar service, etc., you now know who is listening to your show. And subscribers are the key to knowing who is in your audience. And they're also a step in the direction of funding your podcasting endeavors. Of course, the good news here is that you don't have to monetize this step if that's not what you're after. All you need is to have a way for your audience to hear from you in a way other than the podcast. Technically speaking, social media also allows you to identify people in your audience. But I don't include them in this phase because they could just as easily have followed you to figure out if your podcast is worth listening to, i.e. the curious phase, as they could because they actually care deeply for your content. So, in simple terms, an email newsletter that you sync to your podcast's release is the easy way to get this done. A lot of podcast hosts have this service integrated into their platform as well. It's as simple as release podcast, send email. And as we'll see, this is especially useful for podcast hosts that may not immediately alert you to new content. Finally, we have true fans. These aren't just people you have in a list. These are people you know by name. Like Brad. You know them because they post or share your content with every new episode. They're the first ones to respond to your live show by saying that yes, they'll be there, and yes, you better believe they got VIP tickets to make sure they can see you in person. They care about the content you're creating, and they share it widely. So it's important that you don't just think of these people as a loud minority within your show. They're the people who care and can help you build your brand, and they ultimately get people curious about your show, continuing the cycle that started with a post from Brad. So that's it. That's the listener life cycle in a nutshell. Hopefully, you can see the value in understanding each phase, and if you're not quite there, don't worry, we'll be going even deeper on each phase for the rest of this season. To that end, in our next episode, we'll be doing a deep dive into the curious phase of the listener life cycle. So if you're curious about the curious phase, be sure to check it out. Thank you for listening to The Humble Podcaster. You can keep up with the latest on the podcast at humblepodcaster.com, and be sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to connect with us on social media, you can find us at HumblePod on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And remember, stay humble, stay on course, and keep on podcasting. This has been a Humble Pod production. Stay humble.